When the Roman Empire fell, Europe disintegrated into many small states. Local rulers took power, and in some cases they founded their own empires. At one point, Frankish and Saxon kings ruled over territories as big and influential as Rome once was. This was the political background of the Middle Ages. So let's dive in a bit and explain the landscape of post-Roman Europe. Hi, my name is Sebastian and you're watching 7 Facts. Before we begin, let's make one thing clear. The fall of Rome meant the end of the Western Roman Empire, and it led to some major changes in Western Europe. But the other half, the Eastern Roman Empire, kept on going and is called today by historians the Byzantine Empire, and we'll get into that in a later episode. Right, so back to the West. By the 5th century AD, the Western Roman Empire, for this story, I'm just gonna call it the Roman Empire. So, the Roman Empire had some pretty serious military and economic problems, and as a result, its emperors could no longer impose their rule over their territories. So authority was delegated to other commanders, including from outside the border. But there was no way to save the country. Rome was dying. By 410, Britannia broke away, South and West Spain followed in 413, Southwest France in 418, Northern France and the rest of Spain after 451, and the rest of France in 473. 3 years later, Romulus Augustus was overthrown by the leader of a Germanic federation, Odoacer. Augustus was the last emperor of Rome, Odoacer became the first king of Italy, and the Roman Empire was no more. With such a power vacuum in Western Europe, the barbarians quickly moved in and seized power. The Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Anglo-Saxons, and Franks became the new rulers in Iberia, Britannia, Gallia, and Africa. Of all the new kingdoms that came, the Frankish state was the most prosperous and successful. The Franks were a federation of Germanic tribes from today's Belgium and the Netherlands. They were led by Clovis, who managed to conquer a big chunk of the former Roman province of Gallia. This was the foundation of a new empire that would dominate Western Europe for centuries. But what was even more significant was that Clovis decided to convert to Christianity of the Western kind. This is important because most of Clovis's remaining enemies were either pagans who were already on their way out of the history books or Arian Christians. Arianists believed that Jesus Christ was the Son of God but distinct from the Father and not co-eternal with him. Anyway, Arianism held a theological difference in doctrine, a pretty big one, and were considered heretics. But if Clovis would have chosen them instead of the future Catholics, things might have turned out rather differently in Europe. After Clovis died in 511 AD, his kingdom was passed down to his heirs, who would be known as the Merovingian rulers of the Franks. The power of the Frankish kings slowly diminished in the 7th century. Several kings died at a young age and aristocratic factions emerged and fought for power. One of those factions was led by a family known as the Carolingians. They emerged as the dominant family thanks to the alliances that were negotiated by their leader, Pepin II. Between 719 and 741 AD, his illegitimate son, Charles Martel, known as the Hammer, controlled and led Francia in the name of the Merovingian kings. Martel was a very effective leader. He stopped the advance of the Umayyad Caliphate further into Europe, encouraged missionary work, and re-established the Franks as the undisputed masters of Gaul. After his death, power was divided between his sons, Carloman and Pepin. The latter managed to convince the Pope to denounce the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, whom he and his brother chose to be king in the first place, and Pepin III became king of the Franks, the first of the Carolingian kings. There's a reason why I'm citing so many successions, so stay with me just a little longer. We're gonna move past Pepin's reign and concentrate on his son, Charles. From 768 AD, Charles inherited power from his father and shared it with his brother Carloman, who died 3 years later. After that, Charles took all of Francia and became the undisputed leader and began his campaign of expansion into neighboring kingdoms. He came to be known as Charles the Great. Charlemagne. The king met with the leaders of the aristocracy and the clergy every year in the spring to vote on new laws and plan new campaigns. Frankish society revolved around wars, and the leading elite depended on new conquests to gain new territories and riches and expand their supporters. Under Charlemagne, the Franks fought for 30 years against pagan Saxon tribes to the east, whom they forced to convert to Christianity. And it wasn't pretty. In one infamous instance, in 782, 4,500 Saxon pagan prisoners of war were decapitated in a single day after Charlemagne ordered them to choose between death and conversion. Yikes. Charlemagne was, however, viewed with favor by the church. In 773, the Patriarch of Rome, Pope Adrian I, called upon Charlemagne to save the city from the Lombard king Desiderius, who wanted to conquer it. Charlemagne came, invaded northern Italy, occupied the capital Pavia, and proclaimed himself as king of the Lombards. He also led successful campaigns into Spain, but his greatest triumph was the collapse of the Avar kingdom in 796 AD, centered around today's Hungary. Their treasury held the plunder they gathered in 3 centuries, and all of the booty was sent to Charlemagne. With it, he paid for new churches and monasteries and rebuilt Aachen, his preferred imperial residence. Contacts with the Italian and Anglo-Saxon kingdoms enabled Charlemagne to attract lots of scholars to his court. Because of this, the sons of the most important families were sent to his court to be educated. Those same scholars imported religious texts from Italy, imposed monastic rules and biblical studies, and even a new writing system, the Carolingian script, was invented. This period is known as the Carolingian Renaissance. In 802 AD, after 2 failed revolts against him, Charlemagne imposed an oath of loyalty on all free men aged 12 or more. This move did indeed create a direct relationship between Charlemagne and his followers, but it also reflected the downfall of Europe after the Roman Empire collapsed. There was a severe lack of complex administrative structures in the former imperial provinces, on top of a degradation and lack of investment into the roads that once connected said empire. While Charlemagne reformed and improved his administration, he still relied on a handful of statesmen, all recruited from the local aristocracy. The golden age of the Roman Empire was long gone, and a lot of its complexities and advancements were forgotten, and the leaders of Europe knew that and still longed to revert to those ideals. In 800 AD, 2 years before, Charlemagne traveled to Rome. He escorted Pope Leo III back to his seat after he escaped a revolt. The Pope's position of power had been weakened greatly by this, so he decided to make a controversial move that changed the history of Europe. On Christmas Day, at Mass, when Charlemagne knelt at the altar to pray, Pope Leo III crowned him as Imperator Romanorum, the Emperor of the Romans. At the time, the seat of emperor in Constantinople was occupied by a woman, Empress Irene. By crowning Charlemagne as emperor, the Patriarch of Rome effectively rejected the legitimacy of Irene. In theory, this move was intended to represent the continuation of the unbroken line of emperors from Caesar Augustus to Constantine VI, but it had the opposite effect of creating 2 separate states that claimed the same imperial authority. This coronation was one of the main reasons why the Christian Church parted ways 2 centuries later, creating the Catholic and Orthodox churches. On a side note, it was said that Charlemagne didn't want this coronation and rejected the idea of being so tightly roped in with Rome. On the other hand, it's hard to believe that he didn't know what the Pope intended to do on that Christmas Day in St. Peter's Basilica. Charlemagne's rule was followed by Louis the Pious, his son. Louis was intelligent and well-educated, but he was far from being the leader his father was. When he died in 840 AD, the empire was split between his 3 sons, who of course fought amongst each other, and who in turn had even more sons, so the great Carolingian Empire was divided even more. Adding salt to wound, the security of Europe was under threat. The Vikings of Scandinavia came from the north, Arabs were knocking on the southern doors, and the Magyars arrived from the east. Western Europe was now divided into a bunch of small states, governed by local leaders or Carolingian heirs who were constantly harassed by outside forces. In 911 AD, the last Carolingian king, Louis the Child, king of East Francia, died. A group of German dukes then united to elect a new king to rule their lands. The line of Saxon monarchs that was thus born would soon become strong. Out of the ashes of the Carolingian Empire rose Otto I, king of East Francia, from 936 onward. Otto had a stroke of luck when he found silver in the mountains of Saxony, silver with which he paid for an enormous army and built a series of fortified cities. He soon extended his realm and dealt a powerful blow to the ambitions of the Magyars at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955 AD, a victory that ended their invasions in Western Europe. Just like Charlemagne, Otto ensured he had the support of the church by converting pagans, building churches, naming bishops, and he even leaned towards consolidating power to the church rather than the aristocracy. And like Charlemagne, Otto invaded northern Italy and conquered it in 961 AD. The next year, Pope John XII crowned Otto as the new Emperor of the Romans. This was the birth of what would later be known as the Holy Roman Empire. All of these machinations occurred in the courts of Western Europe, but the administration of the actual lands changed dramatically too. After the Roman Empire collapsed and the Middle Ages began, a new system of relationships between kings and noblemen arose. This system would mature after the Carolingian era, expand into Anglia, and would come to be known as feudalism. Under the Carolingians, noblemen were designated to administer territories of the empire in exchange for land and the authority to rule that land, a relationship that was sealed by the aforementioned oath of loyalty. What we call feudalism worked like this. The king or emperor gave land to a nobleman. That land was designated as a fief or feudum in Latin. In exchange for that fief, the lord swore an oath to the king and legally obliged himself to some duties. The foremost of those duties was the dedication of a certain number of days per year to military service for the king. The lord also had to be present at the king's court and advise him on matters of law, justice, and politics. He also had to pay a tax whenever a new castle was built for the king or whenever a royal wedding was held. A nobleman that entered in such a relationship was the king's vassal. Many of these vassals would then sublend their lands to lesser noblemen in exchange for similar duties. This meant that the feudal system quickly turned into a huge, complex hierarchy of vassals and seniors. These social networks would become very complicated since vassals were allowed to accept land from several seniors. This meant that oftentimes there was a conflict of interests since one vassal could owe loyalty to opposing seniors, although usually one senior lord would be identified as a suzerain and would have primacy. This feudal system was deeply entrenched into the lands controlled by the Franks by the 10th century. By this time, Vikings raided along the river Seine and pillaged and destroyed monasteries, churches, villages, and towns. They took advantage of the power vacuum created by the disintegration of Charlemagne's empire. One of the leaders of the Vikings was Rolfl, known in medieval Latin as Rollo. He managed to besiege Paris and do a lot of damage. To make him stop attacking the French coast, Rollo was offered the option to enter vassalage to the king of the West Franks, Charles the Simple. He would be granted a fiefdom, the lands he and his fellow Vikings had previously conquered, where he and his people would be given the right to settle. The fiefdom would be called the Land of the Norsemen, Normandy. This happened in 911 AD. More than a century later, those Normans would be the ones who crossed the English Channel. Over in England, Edward the Confessor was the Anglo-Saxon king from the House of Wessex. Historians have puzzled over Edward's intention for his succession, but it's believed that in 1051 he promised Duke Wilhelm of Normandy to be his heir. However, once a Viking invasion was obvious, Edward promised the same to the Danish Svein Estridsson. The Norseman Harald Hardrada was also promised the throne by a previous king. To top it all off, the actual English lords of course wanted an English king, so Harold of Wessex was also promised the throne. In 1066, Edward died and Harold succeeded him. I'm guessing you know what happened next. The Norsemen of Harald Hardrada invaded from the north almost immediately. They were defeated, but meanwhile, Wilhelm of Normandy crossed the channel and invaded from the south. Harold quickly turned his army, hoping to surprise Wilhelm, but the Norman scouts spotted them, and soon after they arrived in the south, the English were attacked. This was the famous Battle of Hastings. Around 16,000 men engaged in battle, and the English under Harold seemed to have the upper hand. When a rumor spread on the battlefield that Wilhelm died, the Normans began to retreat in utter disorder. But then Wilhelm rode through his forces, showing his face and yelling that he was still alive, and from that moment, the Norman archers and cavalry dominated the already tired English soldiers. Eventually, Harold was wounded and killed. Duke Wilhelm of Normandy became William the Conqueror, King of England. So, from 1066, feudalism spread to England and the aristocracy and clergy were dominated by the French-speaking Normans for centuries. From England and France, feudalism spread to almost all corners of Europe, although in Central and Eastern Europe this system was similar but not quite the same as in the West. We can't end a video about medieval Europe without talking about knights, chivalry, and castles, of course. Knights were basically birthed by the feudal system. They evolved from the heavy cavalry that used to protect kings and emperors like Charlemagne. However, by the 11th century, they were a distinct class of professional soldiers. They became a superior class, and this was underlined through complex rites and rituals like the accolade, the famous rite of passage when a candidate was tapped with a sword on the shoulders to signal their acceptance into knighthood. Knighthood was a special status indeed, in exchange for which one had to fight for and protect his senior, but also defend the church and the poor, and especially those who were under his protection on his lands. But of course, as we all know, not all knights were as honorable as their creed demanded. At first, the duties of a knight were carried out as stated, more or less, but as time progressed, these duties, especially the military ones, were replaced by financial agreements. By the 14th century, knights expected to be paid for their services, and they themselves could pay a tax instead of the promised military service. Nevertheless, knighthood remained a prestigious social and military elite everywhere in Europe throughout the Middle Ages. Castles were also a consequence of feudalism. These constructions were practically the headquarters of a fief. Castles were first and foremost the residence of a senior lord, his family and his servants. There, he would meet his vassals, carry out judging duties and negotiate. Castles were fortified homes for a reason. From there, entire regions could be effectively defended, and in times of trouble, at least some citizens could find refuge within its walls. Kings too had castles. Remember, this was a time with very poor road infrastructure, so communication was pretty dodgy. The best way for a monarch to exercise his power and ensure loyalty was to travel to his domains. So usually, kings and emperors had their own castles throughout the country. When the king was absent, their castles would be administered by one of their vassals. The feudal system began to crumble from the 14th century onward. Merchants became too rich and strong, the printing press was invented and made communication much easier, the Renaissance was on the horizon, vassals preferred to pay taxes rather than do military service, and of course, the repeated plague epidemics killed about half of all Europeans, leaving very few able men to work. These events signaled the end of an era, and the beginning of Europe's domination over much of the world. I hope this video was interesting enough to have inspired you to look into it further on your own. If you liked it, leave a like and subscribe. You can leave your comments downstairs, and you can also check out my Patreon page if you want to support me. I do hope to see you next time. Bye.